Chairs were empty. 3 entire rows of them, draped in white linen and baby's breath, reserved with little handwritten cards I had addressed myself. My mother's name, my father's name, my brother's name, his wife, their kids. I had pressed those cards with my own hands the night before the wedding at my kitchen table in Halifax, telling myself they would show up. They always showed up eventually. That was the lie I had been telling myself for 31 years. My husband. I'll call him the man I married because he deserves to be in the story with dignity. He squeezed my hand when he saw me register the empty rows. He didn't say anything. He just held on. The officiant kept her eyes on us. Our friends filled the other side beautifully. But I couldn't stop looking at those 3 rows, the way the afternoon light came through the windows of that little venue in Dartmouth and fell on fabric that nobody was sitting on. I smiled through the whole ceremony. I am very good at smiling through things. Here's what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. I had been the responsible one my entire life. I was the first in my family to finish university. I put myself through nursing school in Halifax while sending money home to Moncton every month because my father had a way of framing financial requests that made you feel like you were the one failing if you said no. I bought my brother's hockey equipment one winter when I was 23 and barely making rent myself. I missed a friend's wedding in Vancouver because my mother called the night before saying she felt chest pains and needed someone with her. The chest pains that turned out upon hospital discharge the next morning to be stress. Her stress. About a disagreement she'd had with a neighbor. I am not saying these things to make myself sound noble. I am saying them because I want you to understand the arithmetic of what I was working with. The ledger I had been keeping, not to call it in, but just so I would know, so I wouldn't feel crazy. I grew up in a house where love was conditional and the conditions kept changing. My father is the kind of man who, when I graduated at the top of my cohort, said, "I hope you know a degree doesn't make you better than anyone." I was 22. I had worked 60-hour weeks between school and the hospital floor. I stood there in my convocation gown holding my diploma and I thought, I actually remember the exact thought, I wonder what it would take. My mother was softer but in some ways more confusing. She had these moments of genuine warmth, these windows where she would hold my face in her hands and tell me I was her girl, and I would feel flooded with something I couldn't name. And then the window would close and she would say something like, "Your brother really needed you to be there last weekend. You know how he gets." My brother, who had never once driven to Halifax to see me. Not once in 7 years. The wedding invitation I sent them was beautiful. I designed it myself. I included hotel recommendations near the venue, a list of restaurants they might like, a note saying how much it meant to me to have them there. I booked them a block of rooms at a rate I negotiated specifically so cost wouldn't be a barrier. My father texted me 2 weeks before the date, "We're planning on it." That was the entirety of his confirmation. They did not come. They did not call. My brother sent a text at 11:30 in the morning of my wedding day. It said, "Sorry, it's a long drive. Congrats." That's it. That was the message. 11 words, no punctuation on congrats, like he couldn't even be bothered to type the exclamation mark. I read it in the bridal suite, in my dress, with my best friend doing my hair. She saw my face in the mirror. She said, "What?" And I shook my head and put my phone face down on the vanity and said, "Nothing." I smiled at myself in the mirror. I have a very practiced smile. What nobody tells you about that kind of hurt is how physical it is. It sits in the middle of your chest like something swallowed wrong. You breathe around it. You dance around it. And I did dance, genuinely, at my own reception, because the man I married had asked his cousin's band to learn a tragically hip song we both loved, and it was so specifically, privately ours, that I cried happy tears and the hurt moved over for a little while. But it came back. It always came back. The weeks after the wedding were a strange kind of quiet. We honeymooned in Cape Breton, hiked the Cabot Trail, ate too much fresh lobster, slept in. It was the first time in years I had no one to take care of. I kept waiting for my phone to buzz with a family emergency. It didn't. And that absence, the silence from home, was almost harder to sit with than the noise had ever been. Then, 6 weeks after the wedding, my father texted me. He did not mention the wedding. He did not apologize. He did not ask how I was doing, or how the honeymoon was, or whether the new apartment we'd moved into was coming together. He said, "We need help with Donovan's house repairs. Roof is going, and the contractor quoted $14,000. Can you send your share? Your family." My share. I sat with that text for a long time. I am a nurse. I make a decent wage, more than my parents ever gave me credit for, but I also have a mortgage and student loans, and I live in a city where rent is not what it was when they were my age. And I had just paid for a wedding they did not attend, and I had just come back from a honeymoon. And he was asking for my share of repairs to my brother's house. My brother, who texted me 11 words on my wedding day. I thought about what I would say. I drafted maybe 4 different responses over 2 days, measured ones, explaining ones. The kind of message where you carefully explain why something hurt and what you need going forward, and you use I statements and you leave the door open. I deleted all of them. Instead, I opened my banking app. I sent my father $2. The memo line said, "Best I can do." Then I blocked his number. Then my mother's. Then my brother's. I put my phone down and sat in my kitchen in Halifax and waited to feel something dramatic. Some lurch of guilt or fear or second guessing. What I felt instead was very quiet. It felt like setting down something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying so long. My arms had stopped noticing the weight. My husband came home from his shift and found me at the kitchen table. He sat down across from me and I told him what I had done. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "How do you feel?" And I told him, "Lighter." He nodded like he understood. He had watched my family for 3 years. He understood. I want to be honest with you about the next part, because I think it matters, and I think a lot of people in similar situations don't talk about it enough. The weeks after I blocked them were not uncomplicated. There was grief. Real grief. Not dramatic grief, but the low, persistent kind that shows up at odd times, when I drove past a Tim Hortons and remembered stopping there with my mother on road trips when I was a kid, when I saw an older man at the grocery store who walked like my father, when a patient on my ward reminded me of my brother's laugh. You can be completely certain you made the right decision and still grieve the version of the family you needed them to be. Those two things can exist at the same time. Don't let anyone tell you they can't. For 3 weeks, I heard nothing, and then my husband came home from work looking strange, careful, like he was carrying something fragile, and he said, "Someone called the clinic asking about your schedule." I work at a walk-in clinic. Someone had called asking when I worked under the pretense of being a patient trying to book with a specific nurse. The receptionist, who knows me well, had said she couldn't share staff schedules and offered to take a message. No message was left. I knew immediately who it was. I don't have proof, but I know my father's methods. When I was in university and he was upset with me, he once drove 5 hours from Moncton to Halifax and showed up at my apartment without calling, not to talk, just to stand there and make me understand that he could, that he knew where I was, that I didn't get to simply decide I was unavailable. I reported it to the clinic manager. I documented everything, the date, the time, what the receptionist had said, my reasons for suspecting who it was. I had a colleague who's a social worker walk me through what I could do legally at that stage, which at that point was limited, but which established a paper trail. I want to say this clearly because I have seen so many stories where the person just absorbs the escalation and keeps absorbing it. You document. You tell someone. You create a record. You do this even when it feels like an overreaction, because if it escalates further, you will be grateful you did. 2 days later, on a Tuesday evening, I was in the parking lot of a grocery store in my neighborhood when a car pulled in that I recognized. My parents got out. My brother was with them. I want to tell you I was calm. I was not entirely calm. My hands went cold and my heart did something uncomfortable, and there was a part of my brain that went very quiet and very focused, the way it does in difficult moments on the ward. I stayed in my car. I called my husband. I told him where I was and who I was looking at. He said, "Don't get out. I'm coming." My father knocked on my car window. He was wearing the blue jacket he always wore in autumn. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. My mother was standing a few feet behind him, arms crossed, her face unreadable. My brother stood further back with his hands in his pockets and looked at the ground. I lowered the window 2 inches. My father said, "This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. Open the door." I said, "I'm waiting for my husband. I don't want to have this conversation." He said, "You don't get to just cut off your family. That's not how this works. There are sentences you spend your whole life preparing for without knowing you're preparing. That was one of them. I had heard variations of it my entire life. You don't get to. This is not how it works. Who do you think you are?" The grammar of control dressed up as family values. I said, "I'm not doing this here," and I raised the window. He stood there for a moment. Then he stepped back and said something to my mother and my brother, and they all got back in the car. I thought that was the end of it. I sat there and breathed and waited for my husband, who arrived 11 minutes later. It was not the end of it. 40 minutes after I got home, there was a knock at our door. My husband answered it. It was 2 Halifax Regional Police officers. My father had called and told them his daughter was in possession of a joint bank account. We are not, we have never been, I have had my own banking since I was 18, and that I had taken money from it. He said he wanted a welfare check and a discussion about the funds. The officers were professional. They were clearly accustomed to these kinds of calls. You could see it in how they stood, how they phrased their questions, the way they waited without judgment while my husband and I explained what was actually happening. I showed them my bank statements on my phone. I showed them the text exchange where my father had asked for money, the request, and my $2 response. I showed them the blocked contacts. I showed them the documentation I had filed with my clinic manager about the scheduling inquiry. One of the officers said gently, "It sounds like there's a family conflict here, not a criminal matter." I said, "Yes, that's exactly what it is." After they left, I sat on our couch for a long time. My husband made tea. Neither of us said much. The shaking in my hands that I hadn't let myself acknowledge while the officers were there was visible now, and he wrapped both of his hands around mine and held them until it stopped. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it is important and because I don't think it's the feeling people expect. I felt finished. Not destroyed. Not defeated. Finished the way you feel when you submit something you worked very hard on and you know it is the best you could do and you are simply done with it. My father had used the police the way he used every tool available to him as an instrument of the message "I can reach you," and it hadn't worked. I was still in my home with my husband, with my documentation, with my receipts, with every I statement I had failed to send, and every accommodation I had extended, and every empty row of chairs I had stood in front of smiling, and none of it had broken me. I filed a formal complaint about the call with Halifax Regional Police for my record. The officers had already noted in their report that no criminal matter was present. My social worker colleague helped me understand my options for a peace bond if the contact escalated further. It hasn't. It has been several months now. I am still a nurse. I still live in Halifax. My mother-in-law calls me on my birthday and remembers small things I've mentioned in passing and sends me soup recipes by text because she knows I like to cook on weekends. This is what family looks like when it is functioning. It took me a long time to know that. The grief still shows up sometimes. I think it always will. There is a version of my father who could have driven to Halifax, sat in that white draped chair, and watched me marry someone who treats me with more basic decency than he ever managed. That version of him did not exist. I spent a very long time trying to love the version of him that did exist into becoming the version I needed, and it cost me things I am still accounting for. But I am done waiting. I had a patient once, elderly woman, sharp as anything, in for a hip replacement, who asked me if I had family nearby. I said not really. She studied me for a moment and then she said, "Some of us have to build it from scratch. That's not a lesser thing." I've thought about that a lot. There is something clarifying about knowing finally and without hope distorting the view what you actually have. What is real? Who shows up? My husband showed up. My best friend, who watched my face in the mirror that morning, showed up. A handful of people who filled the right side of the room and danced badly to the hip and ate too much wedding cake. They showed up. The 3 rows of white draped chairs were empty. I have stopped trying to fill them. There's a comment I keep coming back to. Someone wrote that letting go of toxic hope is one of the bravest things a person can do. I think about that a lot, because hope on its own is not the problem. Hope is what gets you out of bed, but hope pointed at someone who has shown you repeatedly and clearly that they will not change. That kind is corrosive. It hollows you out slowly, and the worst part is that it looks like love from the inside. I spent a long time confusing the two. What I know now is that there is a difference between being a good person and being endlessly available to people who take that goodness for granted. I used to think that drawing a line meant I had failed somehow, failed at forgiveness, failed at family, failed at being the bigger person. But I've watched what happened when I finally held the line. And I can tell you, the world did not end. My father calling the police was not the devastating blow he intended it to be. It was paperwork. It was 2 officers standing in my doorway, looking at my bank statements, seeing exactly the kind of man they were dealing with. The truth was not difficult to establish because I had been careful and consistent and honest, not to win anything, but because that is simply how I try to move through the world. There is something to be said for that, for being the person in the room who has nothing to hide. That doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from making a practice of doing the right thing even when it costs you, even when no one is watching, even when the person you're doing right by doesn't deserve it. I sent money home for years not because I expected a return. I did it because I believed it was the right thing. And when I finally stopped, I stopped for the same reason. Because continuing had become its own kind of dishonesty. I was pretending a relationship existed that didn't. Pretending was not kind. It was just familiar. The harder thing was trusting my own judgment. That is the part nobody really prepares you for when you grow up in a house that consistently tells you your perceptions are wrong. Learning to read a situation clearly without second-guessing yourself into paralysis, without the guilt flooding back in and rewriting what you know. That took real work. The $2 I sent my father were not impulsive. They were the result of 2 days of thinking, and 4 deleted drafts, and a very clear-eyed understanding of what was actually being asked of me and why. That kind of clarity is earned, not given. You have to build it deliberately, the way you build any skill. And then there is the question of what you do with yourself after. Because cutting contact is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a different one. I am still building mine. I have a husband who shows up. I have a friend who saw my face in a mirror and asked the right question. I have patients who need me to be present and sharp and steady, and I am those things. I had to choose them. That choosing, and the work of becoming someone worth choosing back. That is the whole project, I think. Not the dramatic moments, not the $2, not the police at the door. Just the daily, undramatic work of becoming someone who knows what she's worth and acts accordingly. The chairs were empty. I have stopped trying to fill them.